Welcome, everyone. I'm pleased to introduce Danaë Metaxa, who's joining us today from Penn, where they joined the faculty recently after getting their PhD in computer science at Stanford. They're the director of the Penn HCI group, but I think their work is too broad to be put into any one box like that. They work in both computer science and computational social science. The specific topics that they've published on algorithm audits, social media, targeted advertising, I think will resonate with a very broad spectrum of CITP folks, and I think the turnout today reflects that. And one common theme in their work is centering the experiences of marginalized people. Today, I've really enjoyed their work on sociotechnical audits, and I'm really looking forward to them talking about it today. So welcome again to that.
Thank you, Arvin. It's really nice to be here. Thank you for the very kind introduction. Let me make sure I'm not standing too much in front of this. So my name is Danaë Metaxa. It's actually just an X from Greek. And today I'm going to be talking about some work that I call The Future of Auditing is Sociotechnical. This is going to go into a little bit of what algorithm auditing is, a method that's been developed recently, what it can do. I'm super honored to have Christian Sandvig also. He's one of the first people, maybe the first person to publish in this space. So I will do you proud. And I'm going to be talking about some extensions of that work to make it more socio-technical, what that means, what that enables, and so on. So let me start first with a scenario to set the stage. I would like to introduce you to our friend Charlie. He's a 24-year-old product manager at TechCo. And he sees ads that look like this one for financial topics or educational opportunities, and they tend to feature people who look like him. Now meet Jasmine. Jasmine is also 24, and she does the same job as Charlie. She usually sees ads more like this one that are for products, maybe in this case for a shoe brand, beauty, clothing products, again, featuring people who are like her. So we could already say, looking at this, that it seems like there are some kind of gendered trends going on here in these couple of ads, but how do we know if this happens across all of the ads that the two of them see? Maybe I just picked two here. And further, how do we know if this happens to other people like Jasmine and Charlie? In other words, is this a wider phenomenon, and how can we tell? This is where algorithm auditing enters. So auditing is a method that's been developed in the last 10-ish years for understanding black box AI-powered systems. And it involves this process of repeatedly querying an algorithm with some set of controlled inputs that we have carefully selected and observing what kind of outputs we receive to draw inferences about how that algorithm actually works. So what does it mean for an algorithm to actually work? I mean, this is like a very long question, but to give you sort of a sliver, we need something to compare these outputs against. And essentially what these are that we're comparing against, it's something about the system's implicit or explicit claims or guarantees, how we think it should work or how it must legally is obligated to work. So to give you a couple of examples first of algorithm audits, consider search results. In some of my past work, we've done algorithm audits of the types of political content that appear in search results. So if I do a search on some political topic, what kind of results do I see back? And in particular, when we think about like the news media that appears in those search results, is it very left-leaning? Is it very right-leaning? Is it somewhere in between? Like, what's the distribution of partisanship in search media? And so this is something that we've done, I and many others have done a lot of audits on in the past. There's not necessarily a legal obligation here, like Google doesn't have to show you some particular set of political viewpoints, but there's sort of a social expectation that the results should not be too heavily skewed in one direction or the other, that they should be kind of consistent for different people, maybe not just showing partisans more and more extreme content on their side of the spectrum, and so on. These are kind of like social expectations we have. And so the algorithm audit we did here found that, these political viewpoints are like kind of reasonably distributed across the spectrum, and they're not too different for different types of queries. Another audit that I'll go into a slightly more amount of detail on to show you what that process of auditing looks like was on image bias. So if you do a search for different common occupations like computer programmer, what types of people appear in those results? if it looked something like this, we might think like there's a problem here. Again, this is a social expectation that we think that, these types of images should somewhat more or less reflect the real world. So how do we study whether they reflect the real world? What we do in an algorithm audit is first get some baseline. In this case, for this set of occupations, we collected workforce demographics for the US workforce. In other words, like what does the real world look like in the United States? And we compared the distribution of demographics in the workforce to the distribution of demographics that we found in search results. And so this kind of is a three-step process. First, we collect image results for 100 common US occupations. The next thing we do is crowdsource race and gender annotations for people's perception of who appears in those images. And I feel like often when I give this talk or some, talk about this work to a CS audience, they're like, you should use machine learning. A classic. Maybe, but really what we care about here is how other people perceive these images. So we get crowdsourced annotations. And then we compare the diversity in those images to the real world. And so what an algorithm audit lets us say, sort of display results like this. So here we have on the x-axis the proportion of the workforce that is women in the United States for a bunch of data points that are all different occupations. And on the y-axis, we have the proportion of image search results that had women in them. And so this dashed diagonal line here on the diagonal, this is like where the data points would line up if Google search results looked just like the real world. And so this is significantly underrepresenting women, but not by that much. Like statistics says yes, and eyeballing it says like, it's like not too far off. Meanwhile, when we look at the distribution of people of different racial categories, we find that people of color are definitely underrepresented for the majority of these occupations relative to their representation in the workforce. There are way more people of color who are chefs, for instance, than you would ever find if you do a search for chef. So this is what an algorithm audit does, right? Like in this case, it takes a bunch of potential user queries. It provides those as inputs, in this case, to a search algorithm, and we measure those outputs and kind of compare with some sort of ground truth or baseline that we want to compare against. So going back to this example we started with, the running example that I'm going to use in the rest of this talk is about online advertising, targeted advertising. So I'm going to give you first like a little bit of a landscape of what targeted advertising looks like how this ecosystem is set up. So on the one hand, we have advertisers like a shoe company. And on the other hand, we have publishers, people who run websites where there is space to put ads. And ad exchanges run by a bunch of different players run an auction in between. They basically try to match the advertising content with the space on the page, such that in the end, as a user, you end up seeing ads embedded in your web page. This is specifically focused on browser ads. I'm not going to talk about ads in different apps like Instagram ads or that sort of thing. We could talk about that more though at the end. It's harder to measure, but it's something I'm really interested in. So what can an algorithm audit tell us about this ecosystem? If we go back to Jasmine and Charlie, and we look at some prior work that's been done in algorithm auditing on this topic, we find that, for instance, audits have found that ads are delivered in a skewed manner, with women receiving more feminine imagery and men receiving more masculine imagery in their ads, even when these images were made really, really small, almost invisible to the human eye. So it says something about that targeting system. The system is picking up some attributes, even ones that are not visible to the human user, and directing those ads to different populations, in this case with a sort of gender skew. Auditors have also done studies where they pretend to be advertisers, and they say, I'm going to run 2 ads that are exactly the same, except for the demographics of the person featured in that ad. And what they found doing this kind of auditing is that ads are delivered differently to users based only on the demographics of the person featured. So indeed, you're kind of more likely to see ads that look like you. And these kinds of audits have found biases like this one in ads related to educational content, related to employment opportunities, related to housing. And notably, in cases like employment and housing, it's actually illegal to do this kind of disparate targeting in the United States. Advertisements are not legally allowed to be targeted that way. So audits help us uncover these kinds of potential biases that might be socially problematic, they might be actually illegal. It's kind of targeted at identifying this kind of potential harm that some algorithm might be causing. Now, if you ask the advertising platforms, they'll probably tell you that, actually, they claim that the results here skew because of genuine differences in people's interests. They actually know you better than you know yourself. And so they're showing you content that's not just skewed because, you're a woman and so they show you that womany stuff. No. They know that you actually want to see that womany stuff, right? And so they claim that this is based on this rich data that they've collected about users that, of course, involves like a lot of surveillance throughout your activity online, that they're doing this targeting. So the question we ask in this kind of work is, how do we know if this is true? Is it true that Jasmine doesn't want to see Charlie's ads? Or maybe if you were to ask her, or better yet, if you were to actually try showing her Charlie's ads, might she actually tell you, or might you find that she just hasn't been exposed to those before, and actually she does like them, she does want to see that kind of content? Essentially, we lack an understanding of the counterfactual. We don't know if it's true that Charlie's ads would perform more poorly if they were delivered to Jasmine. And so in this work, we're trying to get at this kind of question. First, using an algorithm audit, and second, by pairing that with what we call a user audit. Because the algorithm audit can tell us what types of content that algorithmic system produces. But in the case of a system like targeted advertising, where the users are totally enmeshed, embedded in that system, what content they see responds to their past behavior and their own previous trends. We also want to audit the users. We want to say, what if we gave them different algorithmic content? How might they respond? And how is that going to affect sort of like the next round in which this system runs, the next round of the game in which people get new ads? So in this recent work, we call this sociotechnical auditing, this pairing of an algorithm audit with a user audit to try to understand both parts of that system that includes an algorithm and users. And we just presented this work at CSCW, where we got an honorable mention, so that's pretty exciting. And in this work, we define sociotechnical auditing, or an STA, as a two-part audit that has that algorithm audit component and a user audit component. So essentially, the algorithm audit part includes, as I said before, right, you change the inputs to the algorithm, you observe the system's outputs, and you draw some inferences about the technical properties of the system. So similarly, on the other side, a user audit changes input to the user and observes the user's resulting behavior, their response to that change, in order to draw inferences or conclusions about the user aspect of that system and the way that these two sort of fit together. And these are not all brand new methods, right? Like in terms of algorithm auditing, we have some traditional algorithm audits. There are also crowdsourced audits where instead of some researcher collecting data themselves, we actually say like, everyone in this room, run this query and then send me your results. So you can audit in a crowdsourced way. On the other hand, user audits, this thing where you change some inputs to people and you see their outputs, this sounds really familiar, right? This is like randomized control trials in medicine or field experiments in behavioral social sciences, and sometimes even A/B tests, which are not exactly audits, but are kind of this process of changing the algorithmic input to some user and seeing how they respond. And so some of these types of audits we would call, under our definition, we would call these STAs because they fulfill this two-part system audit and user audit together. So this sounds like a nice idea, but where does it actually leave us? Like, what can we do with sociotechnical auditing that we couldn't do before? I'm going to give you sort of a preview of what our findings were on this particular study that we did on targeted ads with 244 participants. So the algorithm auditing piece, it let us understand the status quo of targeted advertising and find that it performs like not great, but not terribly, like kind of medium with users. On the other hand, doing a user audit where we change the ads that people see showed us that users are actually able to acclimate to random ads. And so in fact, the efficacy of targeting might be driven in large part by repeated exposure more than some kind of inherent user benefit that the targeting is just so good. So so far, we've covered this piece about the method. What is sociotechnical auditing? The next piece I'm going to talk about is the system that we built to run these kinds of audits. And then the third piece is the case study that we ran over a period of 2 weeks with 244 people, and I'll talk about what those results look like. So in general, we say a sociotechnical audit has these two parts. How do you operationalize that? Like, what do you do next? Well, in order to understand the algorithm as it currently exists, what kind of content it currently shows, we do some phase of observation. We just collect data from the algorithm as it's functioning normally. And on the user audit side, then we do some kind of active intervention where we change the algorithmic content they're seeing and see how they respond to that. But as with all of auditing, kind of the tricky part here is that we have to do this without internal access. So this is for various reasons, right? Auditing kind of by definition is usually done without internal access. And this is important because, you could say like, well, if we got the data from the companies, then we could do this kind of thing without an auditing approach. But of course, we all know we will not get the data from the companies in many cases, right? So we need to develop methods to do this externally. But the other interesting piece is that, as I said, these ad exchanges, there's so many of them, and they're showing us different ads that are kind of interspersed all at the same time. So there's not even like one system here that we could say, like, if only I had an internal access to this one system, I could understand this ecosystem. Like, actually, what we want is a user-centered perspective in which we are collecting all of the data that people are seeing. And so there's not just even one system we could be internal to. It's kind of the value of auditing. So the system that we use to do these kind of audits is called Intervenr, and it's a system for conducting socio-technical audits. It coordinates these two phases, observation and in situ intervention with people in their web browsers, to essentially emulate modified algorithm behavior and measure the impact that this has on the people in the system. And these are consenting compensated participants. It has three main parts. The first is a browser extension that connects to a web app, and it also has then a backend for collecting and analyzing data. And we've kind of designed this system to be something that is reusable. It's not just about studying ads. It's about studying any of these systems where people are receiving content and we want to actually, like, in their real experience, make an intervention and measure its effects. So we have a two-phase study design in the particular study we ran, and also for most of these kinds of STAs, we think this two-phase design is really helpful because in the first week, you can conduct the algorithm audit where you just measure the status quo. And then in the second phase, you do that user audit over the course of another set of weeks to compare. So the system has these sort of few main components that I mentioned. The web application is kind of the place where most things happen. It coordinates the extension and the web page. And the extension supports things like onboarding and core behavior, like logging views and clicks. It does that through a browser extension that people just install in their Chrome web browser. Then going back, the second piece is the web page that sort of has participant user interfaces, also UIs for the auditors. Like right now, that's us, but we want the system to be more widely used. So one day it may not only be us. And it lets people, review the study status and like see how many participants are in the study at a time and whether they're onboarding and offboarding and stuff like that. All of these data sources connect to our database, and then we also have a pipeline for running nightly scripts. I'll kind of talk about why this is useful in the ads case, but basically doing processing of data on the fly, like as we're collecting the data itself. So if we look at the system first from the perspective of a user, the user sees this as like a normal browser extension. Okay, not 100% normal. They sideload it instead of getting it through the Chrome Web Store because what we are doing does not meet Google's terms and conditions. But they install this and it just pops up like any other extension. Once they do that, they can onboard through the web page. It gives them a data management page. Again, we're kind of trying to do science with people here. So if they want to see what data we're collecting, if they want to redact data, they're able to do that. And we also can deploy surveys to them. These are surveys that can be sort of common across everybody, or you can deploy personalized surveys that kind of, show people something that's particular to what they have seen in the past week. Then the auditor's view has things like a study dashboard where you can see how many people are in your study at any given time. It lets you take some quick actions like onboarding and offboarding people. Because again, we're trying to enable these kind of studies more broadly than just this like as a one-off thing. So hopefully this makes sense kind of as like a system setup. Yeah.
You have time for, you want to do questions?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I have a question about, I like the idea of pairing these algorithmic audits and user audits. In this Intervenr system, how much algorithmic auditing do you do? Because it sounded like what you were saying is you just observe the behavior. And then earlier in the talk, it sounded like when you do an audit, you do specifically tailored inputs.
Yeah. So there's a few different flavors of audits. Some of them involve like really specific inputs, where you're like, okay, I have this particular set of topics and I want to see what the system gives me. Some of that work has kind of moved more in the direction of like responding to the question that's like, do people even do those searches? Like, is this realistic to collect data about this thing? And so something else you might want to do is just actually collect data about what it is that people search for and then what they see. Or for example, in like a social media setting, there's not like a default Twitter feed. What you want to collect is data that actual people are seeing in their Twitter feeds. Maybe in some cases you would collect like a default feed, but it's kind of valuable to insert the users at that level too.
And how do you think about sampling in that context?
A lot, and sadly. No, I mean, sampling is such a hard, it's a challenging thing. I think a lot of the power of the system is particularly for enabling intervention. If you want a method that just does an audit and does that as strongly as possible, you probably want to shell out a lot of money to get a representative, nationally representative sample of way more people, but you're probably not going to be able to like change what they see in their web browser. So this is really for enabling these kinds of paired audits. It's not the best standalone system for just an algorithm audit.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you talk about the performance of an ad, do you just mean for the advertiser, the conversion, or do you mean for the user, the experience?
Both, and I'll talk about in detail in a second what we're collecting. Yeah. So having kind of laid out this structure, next we're going to talk about the case study itself. We did on targeted advertising. Getting at this question that's like, how well does ad targeting work? And we'll talk about what well means in a second. But, you know, notably, this is kind of a very fundamental question that because there's not really internal access to that data, it's been super hard to answer. Like, I've been surprised how many people I've talked to in advertising and marketing departments who are like, oh yeah, like we just don't know. That's shocking to me, and I hope that we can know more as we do this kind of stuff moving forward. So how can we investigate the targeted advertising like efficacy of those ads? We need some kind of intervention that disrupts that normal targeting and then sees what effect that has. And the intervention that we designed here is an ablation style intervention where we kind of break ad targeting by showing people ads that are not their own. And I'll show you exactly how we do that. So the design that we use is ad swapping. I think this is really clever. I know. Say in a minute why, but I'm like jazzed about this. I think this is a cool experiment. So we have two randomly paired participants, and in the first week we just observe the kind of ads that they normally see, and then in the second week we take those random pairs and we show them each other's ads. Right. So every time that I go onto this website, any website, and it's about to load an ad, instead of loading one of my ads, it's going to load one of my swap partners' ads without telling me that it's doing that. So why ad swapping? It has a couple of nice properties. The first one is that it maintains some amount of ecological validity. So it's not that we showed people some random images, and it's not that we showed them some like mishmash set of ads that just like don't go together, that have no logic behind them. We know that this is a real ad set that was delivered to an actual other person. The other piece is that doing this kind of random pairing lets us get a sort of more robust measure of how powerful this effect is, because you know, we have different people who are randomly paired and they have different similarities or differences from each other. So we're able to sort of get a sample of, you know, some set of people who are very similar to each other and they were swapped. And for them, it's not a big disruption in their ad content. But for some other people who are very different to each other, when their ads are swapped, they're actually seeing something that's, we would expect, very different from what they're used to seeing. And so how well does ad targeting work? We kind of break this down into two research questions. The first one is how well the current ad targeting system works. And the second is how people respond to this ablated alternative version in comparison. And so we ask about how well it works according to some set of metrics that we are considering: the impact on users, the impact on advertisers, and also the impact across different demographic groups, like in case this is sort of a different effect for different categories of people. And in particular, we use the following measures. So we have, in terms of impact on users, things about their interest in some ads, their feeling of being represented by that content. For impact on advertisers, we're looking at a couple of things. One is recognition, like, do you remember the ads that you saw? And the other one is views and clicks. These are really common metrics, but super lossy. Like, I'll mention a little more about that in a second. And across demographic groups, we consider a bunch of things: race, gender, age, education, income, geographical region, I will not present much of that stuff because for the most part, we didn't see big differences. So how do we measure these things? The first three we measure with surveys. We ask people about their interest in certain content, about whether they feel represented by it, about whether they remember seeing it in the prior week. And views and clicks, we automatically log with our extension. So those survey questions, what do they look like? We have some holistic questions where we give them an image cloud of 40 images that they did see in the past week. And we ask them questions about how many of those they think they recognize, how interested they are in this content overall, whether they feel like it represents them well. And we think this like image cloud thing is useful because it gives them this sort of like bigger picture view of a bunch of ads. And then we ask them also questions on a per ad basis. So we ask each individual user questions about whether they recognize specific ads, whether they're interested in specific ads, and whether they feel represented by those specific ads. And we make sure to sample to cover 3 dimensions here. First, whether the ad was originally targeted to the user or to their swap partner. Second, whether they actually saw this ad or not, and we have the ground truth of whether they did or didn't. And then third, whether it has people in it. There was like some prior work to suggest that maybe people are going to feel represented better by ads that, you know, look like them, which involves them there being people in the ad. So we didn't see a big difference there, so I'm not going to show results about it, but we did make sure that ads had a mix of containing people and not containing people. And so at a glance, we do this 2-week study, 1 week of observation, 1 week of intervention, with 244 participants. We started with about 400 and we had about a 60% retention rate, which sadly is not too far off for how these kinds of studies usually go. And we collected over 500,000 advertisements. About 20% of these were actually viewed, like entered the viewport, because content gets loaded below the viewport that you never scroll to. And 0.04% of these were clicked. That's not a typo. That is the state of advertising in browser. So this is why we had survey measures, and that's the results that I'm going to talk about, because like essentially people just don't click on ads. I remember reading something about like the first banner ad that ever appeared on a website, and like 70% of people clicked on it. They were like, "This is crazy! Like, what's this about?" And nobody has ever clicked on an ad again. It's essentially like what we find. So, okay, now let's look at some of these results. And I'm going to split the results first according to the stuff we found from the algorithm audit piece and then from the user audit piece. So first, if we look at ad performance on interest and whether people feel represented by those ads. These were on 7-point Likert scales. Up top is high interest, high representativity. Down below is low interest or low representativity. And what we find is that in this observational phase where we just look at the ads that are actually targeted to those people, they report kind of middling numbers, like around a 4, sort of neutral. Like they don't love these ads, but they don't hate them. They don't feel super well represented, but also not like 0% represented, just kind of moderate. And we found that this was relatively consistent across different gender and racial groups, sort of hovering around that 4 out of 7. The one difference was that we did find that Black participants reported feeling more interest and more represented by the ads that they see. So we have not gone deeper into that, but I haven't done the analysis yet. We're starting to of the actual ads themselves. And I'm interested in like, is there something different about that content? So this was the algorithm audit piece. It gives us this status quo of targeted advertising. It tells us that it's kind of neutral. It performs, let's say, moderately for users. And the next piece is this user audit where we ablate that targeting and we see what difference that makes. So the first thing we find is that breaking ad targeting does substantially lower ads performance with users. If you show me some random other person's ads for a week, I do report that I'm less interested in them and I feel less represented by them, right? So at a glance, we might say, you know, ad targeting works, right? Okay, not entirely, right? Like we have a bit of insight here, which is that to say, okay, in the first phase, I see my own ads. And in the second phase, I see my partner's ads. And, you know, same for everybody else in that study. The notable thing here is that you can ask me about my partner's ads at 2 different time points, both before I have seen any of them and after I have seen them for a week, right? Because at face, it's like, okay, those random ads don't perform as well as the ones that are targeted to you. But the question we have is like, does this change over time? Like, how does exposure to those ads actually change how you feel about them? So if we look now at just performance on your partner's ads, where again, we have interest and representativity on your partner's ads. So on the left here is before you've seen any of them during the observational phase, and on the right during the intervention phase after you have seen them for a week. We would expect that these should be pretty consistently low, right? The numbers we saw before, it's definitely kind of low. People don't like them that much. They don't feel that represented, but you know, we don't expect that if targeting works, if targeting is like actually showing you some special content for you, there's no reason that just seeing it a little bit longer should make you feel like more represented by it. And in fact, what we see is that over the course of just 1 week, people start to show an increase in that content that was targeted to their partner. So this is kind of surprising. I mean, like, that's just a week. We're being exposed to targeted ads all the time. Like the prior is like all of the years you've been on the internet versus this 1 week. So that was surprising to us. The response, of course, from advertisers is probably like, well, the targeting is still special and different, right? Like, okay, you acclimate a little bit to some extent, but the stuff that we target to you is still the thing that's best for you. So we say, okay, in that case, the stuff that's targeted to me, I shouldn't change how I feel about it just because I didn't see it for 1 week. And we're only running this in browser. So like you've still seen it on your mobile phone, right? Like this is not even an entire holistic change. You're just seeing a little bit less of it for 1 week. So our expectation here is that if targeting works, it should stay moderate. Like it started moderate, it should stay moderate. And in fact, what we find is that we actually start to see a small but notable decline in people's feeling of interest and representativity by their own ad content. Like this, I didn't expect we were going to find this. Like I thought, you know, some amount of targeted advertising, like it works because it's driven by exposure, but like we didn't expect that there should be any change in how you feel about your own ads. Then I started talking to people in marketing and advertising more, and I think this is not wholly a surprise to them. So it's not that it tracks to some other people's intuition, but this was kind of like the overarching thing that we found, right? So we do this sociotechnical audit, and we can say with the algorithm audit that it kind of performs moderately well for people, but people do start to acclimate to random ads. So some amount of this efficacy of targeting is probably just driven by repeated exposure more than some like inherent goodness of that ad content. And I will say there has been some movement by companies like Google and Facebook more recently to move away from really precisely targeting ads and more to like a model of, well, we're going to have, you know, 100 different interest categories and we'll just map you to some of those categories. And that way we're not doing so much surveillance, you know, it's a little bit less personalized. Like they're not doing this out of the good of their hearts. I think the reality is that they too know that this kind of really precise targeting is not necessarily actually working that much better than like some finite number of categories. So that's what we're able to find in this algorithm audit. I'll pause here if you have, yeah.
Can you go back one more slide? I think I wasn't exactly hearing the comparison you were making.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how are you getting like so on the left? Like how are you getting? So what is the blue dot? Is that?
This is the ads that you saw that were targeted to you. Sorry. On the left, this is your the whole left side.
Yeah.
The left is during the observational phase. So before you've only seen your own ads.
Yeah.
This is how you respond to survey questions about your partner's ads.
Oh, this is just from the survey. I see. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Because after they've done this week of observation, we're able to we have paired them already and they don't know that. So we're able to ask them questions about those ads that their partner saw last week.
And they're getting the same block, like you're showing them the same ads in the survey questions, like at each point, or is that getting randomly?
They're
selected
randomly
as well?
selected.
Okay.
Yeah.
What proportion of the difference in terms of people's baseline, like, I don't know, difference in their interest in their own ads versus someone else is made up within this 1 week?
Made
So
up.
it's like, there was people, you showed that the first result was that people like, they report higher interest and representativity in their own ads.
Yeah.
Before the study, and then you showed that there's.
And at the first set of.
Yeah, how much of that difference is made up by this increase? So what proportion?
Oh, good question. I don't know the actual proportion. It's small. It's like, you know, obviously less than a point on this Likert scale.
But the base, so this effect is like less than a point on, this is like, I mean, I'm sitting as far away as possible. So this one is like a difference of like maybe like 0.2 or something.
Yeah, exactly.
And the baseline difference was something like
1.5.
1.5, okay.
You define how well ads do based on the impact to users and to advertisers. I'm
Mhm.
curious how you think about impact to, say, society, which can sound kind of paternalistic, but I can imagine that would be different actually than that, like how users think they want, maybe and what advertisers want as well.
Yeah, do you have
Especially-
thoughts on how we would like operationalize impact on society? I could come up with some, but
Especially if it shows that repeat exposure does change people's preferences.
Yeah, yeah.
It seems like there's a way.
I mean, here's the thing, right? We're all being, as we know, like fed messaging about what kind of people we are, what we should like, how we should be all the time. Some amount of that comes from advertising. In fact, depending on advertising scholars, like who you ask, maybe like a pretty sizable proportion of that comes from advertising. So I definitely think there is an effect on society, but we're not measuring it here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Thanks for the talk, lovely talk. I have two questions.
I have also another section of future work, so
Okay.
we don't have to be totally done yet, but I'm happy to stop and talk about this as long as you all want.
Okay, so I just have two questions. So, I think most of the things that you talked about is, one is gender, the other one is race. So I was wondering if, the methodology that you have, the methodology that you have in this work, could that be applied to other marginalized groups, that people with disabilities? And would that, how do you envision that happening?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of if you want to just do this kind of method, you say, okay, we just collect those demographic attributes and then we see if people from those different groups feel differently or behave differently. I'm really interested in what the actual content is of these ads. So I think the right way to do that kind of work is to find people with specific like domain expertise and be looking at subsets of those 500,000 plus ads that particularly pertain to those topics. So I'm working right now with a PhD from health sciences who also is like has a master's in public health. I'm not quoting her credentials correctly, but basically someone who's done research on what types of food related messaging different categories of people get, in particular racial biases in messaging around like health foods and healthy and unhealthy types of foods and that sort of thing. So as well as things like who gets advertised certain medications or drugs. So we're doing that kind of analysis, like trying to find those ads in particular in the data set and see whether they're being delivered to different people at different rates.
Cool, thanks. That makes me add one more question to my list.
Yeah.
So, the ads were mostly visual, visual, right?
Yeah.
So I think that kind of brings into consideration also that for folks who are not able to see those ads and are only shown like a text summary of it,
Yeah.
does that change things?
Good question. I've not tried doing anything with screen readers to say like what would they pull out of this data, like how does it get conveyed to the user. That's a really good question though. I would be so interested to know. Yeah.
Great, thanks. And the last one that I have is have you considered intersectionality in the analysis?
Yeah, we are in various ways looking at sort of like cross sections of different sets of identities together. It's in this kind of study where you have like 250 people, it's hard to do that statistically because we just don't necessarily have enough people in these different buckets to draw really robust conclusions. We made sure when we collected this data, because we were interested in things like race and gender, to make sure that it was half people of color, half marginalized gender groups. But still, it's hard. I mean, I think you've like written about this. It's hard to do that kind of intersectional analysis with good stats when you have a smaller sample size. So like we do try to do it. I think the better answer probably is to look using theory about like what specific groups are impacted, do studies like focusing on those particular groups. Yeah.
Question about ads, but just wanted to mention the work on intersectionality you were referring to is possibly Angela Nissen.
Yeah, it must be. Yeah. Good shout out.
So I'm struggling to ask those properly, but given what you said about the click-through rate, the ad interest is not measuring in any way how likely they are to click on it.
Yeah.
So what is it measuring?
Well, a lot of the ads that companies run are not actually looking for direct conversion. Like some of them are, but a lot of it is about brand recognition and just like kind of building the idea of a concept in a consumer's mind. So it's that kind of advertising. And in fact, like that's pretty much most of browser ads, because the click-through rate is so abysmally low and everybody knows that. This is with the exception of ads that appear in search, which perform much better because when you're searching for something, like they actually know something about what you want. And we don't swap those ads. It doesn't make sense to swap the ads at the top of the search page and put random stuff there. So we don't do anything with those.
Yeah, in the light of that, most of the ads is not about conversion, and I'm thinking about pre-targeted ads. It seems, I guess, I'm not sure how to motivate the idea that we're surprised that people become more interested in things that they see. It seems like that is the kind of motivation for ads. So I'm struggling to see why this. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, if you ask anybody in psych, the fact that people acclimate to the stuff they see, we totally do expect that. It's just that this has not actually been studied in this domain
Mhm.
because this kind of process is very involved to do. And usually when you do an audit from that perspective, like you can pretend you're an advertiser and deliver ads and see what audiences receive them. But this kind of thing that's like, let's actually change stuff on the user end. Yeah, we didn't run this because we thought like nobody had ever thought of the idea before,
Right.
but the point was kind of to test that idea.
My question is about scale. So some of the studies that you referenced before, scale was very large in those studies because they behaved as an advertiser and ran ads. I guess it's an inherent limitation of the method that you have to recruit participants. So I was curious if you had any thoughts about scale and how to have a larger population.
Yeah, one effort that I'm very excited about that's not mine, on the same timeline though as this work is Mozilla Rally, where this is a system that Mozilla has built that, you know, if you want, you can opt in to participate in these kinds of studies. There are some, the benefits first. They have like 10,000 people or something in this panel, much larger scale. The drawbacks are that you're getting the specific set of people that like are nerds enough to want to be involved in research that Mozilla is doing, like they even know about this effort. So, you know, sometimes, well, whatever, we always have sampling issues, but like that's sort of one of those issues. The other thing is that you can't really do big interventions. I feel like this one is not so disruptive, but in other cases, you might want to really substantially change somebody's experience. Mozilla is able to do this at such large scale, A, because they have like access to people who know about them, and B, because they say like there's a volunteer basis, like you can just sign up, we're not paying anybody. And so heavier interventions can't really operate in that model because even if you love Mozilla a lot, you're not going to say, yeah, I opt in for you to block me from all my social media sites for a week or something, right? There's kinds of interventions where people might actually like not be willing to do it on a volunteer basis. But I think that's one solution to scale. Another solution could be to try to get some kind of like longitudinal panel that you know, kind of Nielsen score like that opts into doing this sort of thing over time. You probably still have to pay those people, but maybe if it's backed by some particular funder, you could try to do something like that. I'm really interested in how this would work. I got home the other day and I checked my mail. I wish I had a photo of it in this presentation. And I got a little pamphlet from Google that's like, Google and Pew are doing a study. And like, you, Philadelphia resident, can enroll to be in our study for a year. We're going to pay you like $100. And who knows, like God knows what they're measuring. I went on the website and they're like, we're going to do things to understand how to do more efficacy in ads. And I was like, these homies are taking my research ideas and offering me $100 for a year. I kind of am tempted to sign up just to like, see what they're doing. Yeah, I don't know. So if you're as big as Google, maybe you can pay a lot of people $100 for a year. That's another ideal that I have about scale.
I'm curious about the framing as socio-technical. I understand that you're adding the user back, but why is that not like psychotechnical, or what's truly social about it?
The motivation is that socio-technical refers to these particular kinds of systems that have users embedded in them. And so it's those types of systems that you would want to do this audit on. So that's why we name it after that type of system, just using, we just lifted the name of socio-technical systems and yeah. We started with different name, like I think we're saying intervention audit for a while. So yeah, the nomenclature has kind of changed, but rather than naming it after the specifics of the method, we decided to name it after the places where you would want to deploy it.
More of a clarification question. So these are ads which you see on the browser when
Yeah.
looking at different websites,
Yeah.
not on your Facebook feed or something.
Yeah, well, your feed, you also do logos in browser, so we should be collecting those as well. But it's not like if you're using the Instagram app or anything else on your phone, in the browser on your phone, we're not collecting that data. Yeah. Which is too bad. I think honestly, some of the most effective ads are being run specifically in the Facebook ecosystem. They have a lot more data about people and data about all of the people that those people know. So I do think that they actually are doing something that's pretty different. And I don't think necessarily these results would hold up in that setting. And, you know, and depending on the audience, maybe people are more inclined to agree or disagree with that. Sometimes I talk to people who are like, I'm never impacted by ads. I don't even remember a single ad that I have ever seen. And then I have to sit there feeling like a little stupid because I'm like, well, you know, I got these tattoos after I was served an ad for this tattoo artist on Instagram. That's like a kind of permanent change to my life that I made, you know? So yeah, I think some ads are better targeted and do actually affect people much more, including me. Yeah. Cool. So I want to talk just a little bit then in the last like 10 minutes or something about some of the implications of this work, like sort of further studies that we could do that my group is working on now. So we're really excited, you know, beyond this case study on advertising, on kind of trying to apply this method in a wider range of areas. And some of those would be, like I said, social media or news media consumption, education. I'm so sorry you can't make it through a single talk these days without hearing about generative AI. We're doing that here too. So I'll talk kind of very briefly, and I'm happy to go into more detail about any of these, about a set of, an honestly too large subset of some of these other studies. So first, in the space of auditing, something that like taking a kind of user focused perspective, something that we started thinking about in the field lately are non-expert audits. So one piece of work that I have been involved in already finds that these kinds of end user audits where end users themselves are acting as the auditor, that they have sort of domain expertise and context where they're able to surface issues that expert auditors would miss. Also some work on everyday audits that are happening on TikTok. We have an ongoing project like this where we're finding that sort of there's a lot of grassroots behavior that people engage in where they are doing essentially what amounts to an audit at an individual scale and even like as a community, but they don't conceptualize it this way. And there are some really interesting differences about how they do those. One of the main ones is kind of the motivation. We're in the process now of like analyzing some of this data, and you know, audits are kind of framed with this harm mindset of like, you know, bad things are happening online and how can we understand that? And a lot of people's end user or sort of grassroots everyday auditing behavior is actually like because it's fun, with this kind of angle of like play and joy that has not been written about in the literature yet. So that's the thing that we're working on. Yeah.
Can you give an example of that?
Yeah. The most notable example that we see, we've collected kind of like a sample both of like random people doing auditing like behavior with filters on TikTok and also of like popular videos. And the most widely represented thing we find is that there are these generative AI filters where you take a photo of yourself on TikTok and they like turn you into a kind of cartoon character. They like mangify your photo. And users have found that if they change stuff about how they take that photo, it will give them different images. For example, if you have short hair like I do, and the system thinks that you are a man, it will just show you like some serious man. But if you start doing things like, oh, what if I put a mop on my head so it looks like I have long hair? And what if I like, you know, unbutton my shirt? Will it give me cleavage? And so people do these kinds of repetitive queries of that system, trying to get it to output some particular behavior where like essentially they want to look like a sexy manga girl. And this is super widespread. People have a really fun time doing this. And what they're doing is a repeated querying of this algorithmic system to see if they can like get it to output some particular output. Yeah,
That's great. Thank you.
yeah, it's super fun. And it's like a really refreshing change from a lot of the auditing work that's very doom and gloom. So I like that. Also, sort of along these lines, a lot of the people doing this are young people. And I'm working with a professor in the School of Education at Penn doing understanding how high schoolers, like a group of actual high schoolers, how they and their peers engage with these kinds of technologies, how they conceptualize them. We're running a series of workshops. We had the first one this past Saturday, both to understand the kinds of grassroots auditing that they do, and also to maybe give them this framework around sort of how audits work in case that's like a useful vocabulary or method for them to practice. I want to highlight also the PhD students that are involved in each of these efforts because, you know, this is how academia runs and these students are like really doing a great job. The next piece is around, you know, the benefit of this kind of STA framework is that rather than just understanding the status quo, it lets us experiment with alternatives and see like how some different system, different algorithmic design might do better or do differently. So one example of that is some work that we're doing auditing social feeds. I have some like caveats on this project, namely that Twitter as we know it is not doing well these days. We had some different ideas when we started the work. But essentially what we're doing in this work is a socio-technical audit where we compare the news content that people see in their Twitter feeds, where like first we let them just do their natural user behavior. You can flip between like the following feed or the For You feed and just seeing what people do normally, then enforcing that they stay on the following feed for some amount of time and we collect what kind of content they see there. And the same thing another week of what they see on their For You feed to compare both like algorithm audit style, what's the different types of media that are appearing in these different feeds, and also, you know, how do people feel about them? Like, is it having a user impact? Because a lot of this work in auditing and news consumption has been focused on trying to quantify what types of, like, do they see misinformation? Do they see like partisan content? But to do this other piece that's like, how do people actually feel about that content as well? And this is being led by Stephanie Wong, who's one of my PhD students at Penn. And I promised you, I'm so sorry, auditing workplace uses of GPT. Some of these are sort of more classic algorithm audits where we know that these kinds of models are getting used in hiring settings. And so we're interested in whether they display the kinds of biases that other types of hiring systems do, including humans as a hiring system. Then moderation behavior, kind of understanding like systems like LLMs, GPT, for example, have different guardrails up where different types of content gets moderated. So we're trying to understand, again, like classic audit style, what different types of moderation are going on. And then the third one is some work on tone effects. Like if you give someone an LLM that produces text with a very like authoritative tone versus a more hesitant tone, how does that interact with like their natural writing style, their natural inclination to write a certain way? Do they have a better or worse experience using these sorts of systems that either match or don't match their existing style? And again, PhD students involved in that, not all PhD. And then finally, going back to, I spent like several years now doing this dive on targeted advertising. And the question is kind of like, for me, was sort of like, what am I going to do with this knowledge that I have about targeted ads? And the answer, of course, is disrupt, try to take down the whole system. Like that's where that whole work left me. Again, proof of concept, maybe more than, no, I don't know. I mean, I wish I could take down all targeted advertising. We'll see how this goes. Essentially, what we want to do here is we're thinking again from a user perspective that there are opportunities, we think, for collective action. This is an ecosystem so far that kind of buys and sells our attention without us being agents in that economy. And that is the notification that I have that I am teaching in 5 minutes, but I'm not because I'm here. So what we want to do is essentially see if we can enable people to do some kind of collective action and reinsert their role, like their piece of this economy. So imagine that I can set up a kind of, we're calling it ad mixes, like a playlist type of thing, where I say, I only want to receive ads from companies that I think meet my bar of being eco-friendly. Or I only want to see clothing ads that feature plus size models. And other people could sort of sign on to those mixes and maybe contribute to them. And we can provide them a system that lets them say like, yeah, I want to use this particular filter, this ad mix that only shows me these types of ads that match my personal priorities, my preferences, my ethical standards, this kind of thing. If this worked at scale, we would essentially be in the position of having advertisers have to change their behaviors, the eco-friendly practices of their company, the types of models that they use in order to get access to the audience that they're trying to target. And so that's the kind of collective action that we're thinking about building the system. We are building the system to try to enable. And my student Princess is leading that project. So this is kind of the subset of all of those. I have them on a slide in case you want to flip back and ask about any of them. But on the whole, this is kind of what I see as some of the future of auditing. the ways that we are making it more socio-technical and kind of where I think it's going to go next. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk, really amazing. One thing I'm wondering is regarding the moderation in generative AI. I'm also wondering if if y'all have thought or done any work on kind of moderation experiments on social media. So saying, which is very hard, right? Because what is happening beyond the wall changes so frequently, and so you kind of violate all kinds of experimental assumptions. But I'm wondering.
We have not. Yeah, I find it super interesting. Yeah, I would love to say something like that. Yeah.
Hey, thank you so much for this. It's such an exciting project and the whole trajectory, and yes, I'm excited. So I guess it's like a fanboy question. The fanboy question is,
Christian, I am your fanboy.
No,
I was my fanboy.
I was super struck by the kind of abrupt shift in your tone when you decided to burn it to the ground. Because that came at like the end of the talk, right?
Yeah.
The rest of the talk was remarkably respectful toward advertisers, in my view, right? Like if an advertiser told me, well, the reason we run it this way is that our targeting is so effective, I would just think you guys are full of shit. Like, and so,
but now I can tell them with data that they're full of shit.
I know, but I mean, the thing I want, this is a fanboy question, right? Because I'm excited about the burn it down part more.
Yeah,
and I think that is also more consistent with like why we use the word auditing and why the structure of it is adversarial. So I think, you know, the first part, couldn't it have been commissioned by like, I don't know, Procter and Gamble? Like they want to see if their ads are doing what they hope and if they should go with mass market or targeted. And so they hired you and you're gonna come.
Yeah. The first piece is adversarial against the ad exchanges.
Yeah.
So because like I have beef with advertising in general as a concept and advertisers, like what they do and why they do it. But the fundamental sort of like underlying economy here is that nobody knows whether it works except the ad exchanges. And they have every incentive to just tell everybody that it works. And they're making an excessive amount of money doing that. So that's like the piece of evaluating whether it works. Like, yeah, I guess advertisers do want to know these things, but more importantly, ad exchanges don't want you to know these things. So that's the angle on the first part. But I am really excited and like interested in doing this sort of collective resistance type of systems building.
Well, can I ask a follow-up?
Yeah.
So a quick follow-up would be then like there was this period, because you've been looking at ads for a while, so there was this period like 5 years ago where it was faddish for the platforms to open up their advertising system because they thought users would find so fun that they would be like help train the system by, you know, and then it closed up again. And I'm wondering what you thought about that moment, because I like gave it to all my classes, right? I was like, look in the ad system and have a look at how you're targeting, and it because it seemed like really garbage. Like it was hilarious. It was a great activity. Like it says I love corn dogs. You know why? It says I should buy a used ambulance. Like this doesn't have anything to do with my life. And so it seemed like maybe they closed it down because it was more embarrassing than anything else. It didn't show like this laser-like targeting knowledge of your inner desires. So I wonder what you thought about that kind of moment.
If we're being honest, I don't think that they closed it because it didn't look good. I think that they closed it because there was a lot of pressure at the time to make more data available. And there was sort of a lot of wave of pushback against like social media companies at that time. And I think some of that has sort of abated. And now that they're less directly under pressure, they're just backing out of all of it. I don't know that they really ever expected people even to use it very much. Like your students certainly are looking at it, but like, is anybody else? I don't think so. And I think mostly what they were going for is like the nice headline that says like, oh, Facebook is like, they're so committed to election integrity that they're going to show us what ads we see. My friend Ronald Robertson calls this the diesel engine problem. Like, do you remember a while back when I think it was VW was found that they were like cheating on the emissions reports of all of their engines because like the car, once it's hooked up for measurement, it just produces like, you know, lower emissions and like fakes the numbers basically. That whole thing went on for such a long time because it's very hard to prove differently. And even at the very end, after they got sued and had to pay and everything, they still claimed that, oh, but not all the cars were doing this, actually just some of them. That's the kind of claim that's impossible to refute. So this is sort of the diesel engine problem of Ronald uses it to talk about, and I agree with him, this kind of data that's provided by the company. Like, anytime that the company is providing the data, you just can't really trust that data. So, yeah, like I just am not that sad even to see those efforts go, because I didn't really believe in them very much in the first place. Yeah.
We're at
that's how-
1:30 now.
Yeah,
We'll
great.
end the official part of the talk at this point.
Thank you.